Okay, I am going to be on the second part of chapter 2 of Pontius Pilate, which is, for those of you following along, on page 19 of this book where the break occurs. The intervening weeks now saw Procula shopping for the indeterminate stay in Judea and preparing for the nuptials. Pilate was occupied with grooming his successor at the Castra Praetoria, consulting with Sejanus on Roman provincial policy, and learning as much as he could about Jews in Judea. Annius Rufus proved helpful there. He had been prefect of Judea from 12 to 15 AD, just before the present incumbent Valerius Gratus, and he was now living in retirement at Rome. 3 years was too short a time for me to accomplish much in Judea, Rufus apologized to Pilate, but I don't think Gratus has done very much more in his 11. The tone was that regularly used by predecessors who evaluate the work of successors. No, those were fairly quiet years for Judea, he continued. There had been a rebellion at the time the census was taken, but nothing much more since then. So the people aren't really that hostile to Rome, Pilate ventured? I didn't say that. They're always looking for a chance to shatter what they call the Roman yoke. But don't give them that chance. First requirement for any governor of Judea will have to be firmness. Only after that comes justice and good government. Rufus continued with a rundown on who supported Rome in Palestine. Generally, some of the educated and ruling establishment, including priests. The common people could swing either way, while a group Rufus identified as the Zealots might, he happily assured Pilate, slip a knife between his ribs some dark night. The former prefect alerted Pilate to other difficulties. You'll be understaffed, undermanned, and undersupplied out there. Rome really should station a legion in Judea instead of those cursed local cohorts, which is probably the reason you got the appointment, Pilate. The prefect of Judea must know his military tactics. Why not a legion then? I could suggest it to Sejanus. A legion would be like a big group of Roman soldiers. No, the canny Rufus corrected him. I doubt if Tiberius would spare a legion. Besides, legions are usually commanded by senatorial legates rather than equestrian prefects like yourself. So let things rest as they are, and I don't think Tiberius would like another senatorial legate in the east. Do you know why, young man? Probably because he fears the Senate will interfere in foreign policy. Even now, the legate Lamia is detained in Rome instead of governing Syria. Exactly. All Roman provinces beyond Italy were of two kinds. Senatorial provinces, the older, pacified areas administered by the Senate, such as Sicily or Greece, and imperial provinces, lands which Rome had acquired comparatively recently and which might require special military intervention, such as Egypt and smaller border territories like Judea. The latter were under the direct control of the emperor, who often sent equestrian rather than senatorial officials to govern them, in order to balance the two upper classes off against each other. A senatorial legate governing Syria, for example, would find something of a modest counterpoise in the neighboring equestrian prefect of Judea. If one stepped out of line, the other would surely report it to the emperor. But any advice I give you is bound to be a little outdated by this time, Rufus admitted. It's more than a decade since I was in Judea. Hardly seems possible. Gratus will give you a full briefing in Caesarea when you take command. Yes, Pilate acknowledged. But one thing still worries me, Rufus. I've served in Syria, so I know something of the country, and a little of the Near Eastern mind. But I've had hardly any contact with my future subjects, Jews. Well, I've run across them here in Rome. Who hasn't? But I have no friends of that persuasion. Naturally, snickered Rufus, with typical Roman prejudice. But if I went over to the Trans-Tiber, I could find some of the leaders of the Jewish community there. Do you think I'd gain anything by talking with them? Not really, said Rufus, for several reasons. While the Roman Jew is related to the Jew of Judea, he may also be very different, depending on which faction he follows. Just an example, one of their synagogues here in Rome is called Congregation of the Herodians, in which they teach that King Herod was the Messiah promised in the scriptures. Messiah, indeed, he laughed. Most Judeans would be revolted by such a thought. But don't worry, Pilate, you'll learn your Jews very quickly after you set foot in Judea. This talk of a Messiah, what's it about? Messiah is Hebrew for the anointed one, Rufus said, who is to be a kind of religio-political deliverer of his people, sent by their God, no less, to liberate the Jews from the oppressions of every kind, and oppressors, by which they mean us. A new world monarchy under the Messiah king is to replace the Roman Empire, and an era of peace and prosperity will descend on the earth. So if their Messiah appears, I suppose Rome would be obliged to disappear. I'll keep an eye out for him, chuckled Pilate. But at last a question But a last question, Rufus. When you were in Jerusalem, did you ever get a glimpse into the forbidden recesses of their temple? You mean their Holy of Holies? I think that's what they call it. No, and don't you try either. It would spark instant rebellion. Of course, I was only wondering if it were true, the rumor that there's a statue of a wild ass in there, or an ass's head, which supposedly represents their deity. Weren't the Hebrews fleeing from Egypt and dying of thirst in a desert when a herd of wild asses guided them to a spring of fresh water, and so they worshiped the ass image in their temple? I've heard that story, but it must be false. At least there's no statue of an ass in the Holy of Holies. Pompey was the last Roman to look inside the sanctuary after his conquest of Jerusalem, and he found it stark empty. And that does go along with the Jewish belief that their God cannot be represented in sculpture or painting of any kind. Pilate took leave of Rufus with due thanks, even though he was under no delusions that his knowledge of Judea had been much enhanced by their discussion. The month of May was a paradox. Though Italy was fragrant and bursting with spring, this was the time in the religious calendar for gloomy exorcisms of ghosts. But like most Romans, Pilate and Procula gladly left this task to the priests while they made final preparations for their wedding. It would be one of the prominent equestrian events of the spring social season at Rome. In deference to the memory of Senator Gaius Proculius, noted senatorial and patrician families had indicated they would attend. Sejanus and his numerous satellites promised to grace the occasion, along with the Praetorian officer staff, and even Pilate's relatives from Samnium would converge on the Proculius mansion that June. Pilate's father, a retired civil service official named Pontius, had shrewdly advised his son not to be timid when discussing dowry with Procula's father. This was a sticky point in Roman matrimony. Weddings had actually been canceled when prospective in-laws could not come to the terms of the size of the dowry. But such distasteful haggling proved unnecessary in Pilate's case, since Proculius had vast holdings and the nuptial contract that he offered proved him a generous father-in-law to be, money that he's going to pay Pilate to marry his daughter. On the day of the wedding, a chain of ceremonial was meticulously observed, some of it dating from the dawn of Rome. The night before, Procula had dedicated her childhood trinkets to the household layers, those good spirits of her old home whose protection she would abandon the next day. To ensure good fortune, she slept that night in a tunica recta, an expensive ivory-colored bridal tunic woven in one piece from the top down. At early dawn, the same tunic was now secured to her waist by a girdle of wool fastened with the knot of Hercules, a complicated hitch named for the guardian of wedded life. Only the new husband might untie it. Dressing the bride was a mother's prerogative, and Procula knew that hers would make a ritual of it, since she was an only child. For weeks, the mistress of the Proculius household had been planning this wedding, but now that the day arrived, her well-chiseled features were drawn with worry that some important item had been overlooked. With exquisite care, she applied several strands of silver jewelry and finally took a spear to her daughter's head. Ancient custom, betraying the violence of tribal marriage by capture, demanded that the bride's hair be parted by a sphere into 6 locks. A flowing gossamer veil of red-orange silk completed the ensemble, held in place by garlands of flowers. While her mother brushed aside a tear or two, Procula looked at herself in the mirror of highly polished metal and was frankly pleased. Meanwhile, dressed in a gleaming new toga, Pilate was surrounded by comrades who crowned his head with a floral wreath. Then a glad troop of Ponti and their friends accompanied him for the short walk over to the Proculius residence, which they found surrounded with rows of parked litters and waiting slaves. Litters are like carts, basically, that the slaves would carry. Wreathed with boughs of greenery and fairly sprouting with flowers, the mansion seemed more an arboretum. Incense and exotic perfumes hovered about the house, since the warm, breezeless June morning provided little diffusion. Inside, Pilate was heralded with a glad shout from the great throng of guests, but all eyes quickly returned to the robed auspex, who was busy taking the omens. He was an honored friend of the Proculi, who, acting as an unofficially priestly augur, had a messy but necessary task to perform. "Bring forth the consecrated ewe," he sonorously intoned, for the ancient rite which inaugurated all public functions in Rome was about to begin. The assembly of guests hushed with anticipation as a baraboned sheep was led to an altar set up at the center of the atrium. It was important that the animals seemed to approach willingly, so a little fodder had been strewn below the altar. The sheep saw it, bleated approvingly, and hurried to its fate. The augur sprinkled a little incense, meal, and salt on the victim's forehead, offering a prayer in what was supposed to be Etruscan, a nearly dead language. Then he took a sacred mallet, cradled the head of the sheep in his arm, and smashed its skull with one blow. After cutting the throat of the dead creature, he caught the blood in a basin and sprinkled it on the altar. Finally, he carefully slit open its belly to inspect the liver, intestines, and gallbladder, which still quivered and twitched with departing life. Absolute silence commanded the hall. If the entrails were in any way abnormal in such rites, armies could not go out to fight, the Senate would suspend its business, and certainly weddings would have to be postponed. Since this was a dismal prospect after so much planning, Roman nuptials habitually had a second ewe in reserve in case the first ungenerously presented bad entrails. This gave way to an even more logical custom. The auspex at the weddings was never to look too closely for abnormalities, and he never did. After further probing and hesitation for due effect, the augur finally looked up. "Exta bona," he cried with a smirk. "The viscera are good." "Bene, bene," shouted the guests. It was now proper for Procula, who never suspected anything could go wrong, to give a glad sigh of relief. The wedding could proceed after all. She and Pilate solemnly entered the atrium. As a bachelor of long standing and a man of experience, Pilate had always assumed he would face his wedding ceremony with a certain cool detachment, if not resignation. But now, watching his bride approach him, he was quite unexpectedly overtaken by a flood of complex emotions. Initially, but thankfully, for only one terrifying instant, the girl appeared to be a total stranger, and Pilate could not imagine what this young, rather silly-looking girl had to do with him. Next, he was convinced that the whole ceremony would degenerate into a long series of disastrous social blunders, making himself and his bride the laughingstock of Rome. First, he, or worse, Procula, would be unable to remember the few simple procedures of the wedding ceremony. Then, instead of proposing the graceful toast at which he had so much practice in his public career, he would find himself tongue-tied at the crucial moment and blurt out only a few incomprehensible words. Mercifully, at the sight of Procula's sure and graceful pace as she walked toward him, Pilate returned to normal, felt secure in his love, and took a slight step forward to meet his bride. Procula's pronuba, or matron of honor, now led the bride over to the groom. The pair joined right hands. "Ubi tu Gaius ego Gaia," said Procula, looking serenely into Pilate's eyes. A little lad called a Camillus now presented a covered basket from which the couple took a cake of coarse wheat bread and placed it upon an altar, offering prayers to Jupiter, Juno, and several gods of the countryside. Then a cry erupted from the assemblies of guests. "Feliciter, feliciter, good luck, happiness," for the two were now man and wife. A lavish wedding banquet commenced, with festivities lusting throughout the day. Proculius was known to set a superb table for even the commonest meals, and the nuptial feast for his only daughter was exactly the gourmand's delight everyone had anticipated. Of the 7 courses which followed, roast boar was the principal dish, but there were also more exotic viands, including Phrygian grouse, Gallic chitterlings, roast peacock, Caesarean oysters, and the crowning delight, Corsican mullet. At a time when Rome's vulgar rich were inflicting 15 and 20-course dinners on their friends, Proculius, the guests agreed, had shown remarkable restraint in his menu. To wash down the delicacies, Proculius had invaded his deepest wine cellar and retrieved rich Chalbonium from Damascus and other eastern vintages in honor of the newlyweds' approaching journey, as well as Centennian and Falernian, the finest local wines. Some were chilled with snow, which several of Proculius' slaves had carried down at great effort from Apennine mountain summits. With the last course of the day-long feast came distribution of the wedding cake, traditionally served to guests on bay leaves. Then the darkening twilight reminded everyone that a final important stage of their celebration had been reached. "Pompa! Pompa! The procession!" cried the guests. The time had come to escort the bride to her new husband's home. While a band of flute players and torchbearers assembled at the door of the mansion, Procula embraced her mother and started sobbing. The groom walked over and brutally tore his bride out of her mother's arms, while she screamed all the louder. But all the guests were laughing and cheering, for the whole scene was just an act, the customary show of violence which etiquette required at Roman weddings ever since the rape of the Sabine woman. I don't know what that refers to. Procula quit struggling and broke into a radiant smile at her captor, kissing him happily before she took her place in the procession, which headed down the Via Tiburtina toward the heart of Rome. The flute players led off, their music inviting any of the bystanding public to join the procession, as join they could and did. The torchbearers and younger wedding guests followed. Next, the bride herself, attended by 2 boys holding her hand on either side, while a third carried a wedding torch of twisted hawthorn in front of her as a charm against the magic. The little Camillus pranced along proudly with his basket. Bridesmaids just behind Procula were carrying the symbols of her future domestic life, the distaff and spindle. Then, almost as an afterthought, came the groom, who threw walnuts to the street urchins of the city as symbols of fertility. Last in the procession marched the parent Proculae and Pontius, their older friends and relatives, and finally a roistering honor guard of praetorian officers. Since he would be leaving Rome shortly, Pilate had not purchased a house for himself. Instead, a fine old friend of the Ponti, who had retired to his mountain villa for the summer, graciously allowed the newlyweds to use his townhouse during their remaining weeks in Rome. It was here that the noisy, lusty, flame-flickering cavalcade delivered the bridal couple. Now Procula was lifted over the threshold, for a chance stumble at the door would have been the worst possible omen for her future married life. Inside, Pilate offered her a glowing firebrand and a small vase of water, symbols of life and worship together. Procula accepted these, repeating a final time the wedding formula, ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia, and then lit the fireplace with the torch which had preceded her. The hearth blazed up in soaring triangles of flame, a good omen. After Procula prayed to the gods for a happy marriage, her pronuba led her to the nuptial couch, which was situated in the atrium. Then she left, closing the door behind her. Pilate's officer friends serenaded them just outside the door, a time-honored nuptial song, and then they too left. Bride and groom looked at each other and smiled. It was the first silence and solitude they had experienced since dawn. He took off his now wilted floral wreath, and she did the same. He unwound himself from his suffocating toga, but she just stood there shyly. Pilate pulled off her flaming red veil, gathered into his arms, and kissed her tenderly. Then he lifted the lissom little figure off her feet and carried her over to the marital couch, which they would use that night and never again. And that is the end of chapter 2 from Pontius Pilate.